Hey guys, welcome to the discussion of Power BI. In this session, I'm going to talk about what is incremental refresh, a very interesting option in Power BI where you can control the way your data get refreshed. Before I get into the example, let me explain you what is incremental refresh. It's a feature by which you can control how the data in your data report that you have published in Power BI service is getting refreshed. For example, you have 20 years of data in the dashboard that you have published in Power BI service. Now, every time you schedule your refresh, the 20 years of data will come and your whole report will get refreshed. Again, for example, tomorrow 10 more data gets added to your existing data set. And again, when the refresh activity starts in the Power BI service, again those 20 years of data will be uploaded to the report along with the 10 new data. Now, what if we work on a process where we only want to update the 10 new data that is added to your data set instead of loading the 20 years of data again and again? This kind of scenario is taken care by the incremental refresh. Now, there are few prerequisites that we need for incremental refresh, and therefore few features also. The features are why we need incremental refresh. We need because it refreshes faster. Obviously, it will refresh faster because every time the refresh process starts, it will not take 20 years of data. For an example, it reduces the resource consumptions. Means when a less data is getting refreshed, all the resource or the memory or other resource which are managing your data and the refresh will function in on an optimal performance. And the third and the most important feature is it's easy to set up and it is always good for large data sets. This is why we need incremental refresh. Now let's discuss about the requirement. Incremental refresh is only workable in Power BI Pro and the premium license holders. I repeat, you cannot do incremental refresh at the basic level of Power BI service or Power BI desktop. You need to have a pro license and a premium license to avail this particular service. It works only where the query folding is applicable. If query folding is not supported, incremental refresh will not work. That means your data should have the query folding option. Your data should be connected to a server. You cannot do an incremental refresh with a flat file. And when you're connecting to a server, it should be always be in import mode. If you remember, in my sessions, I have discussed about how we can work on the different types of connections, import and direct query and etc. Right? The third important prerequisite is the table must contain a date column, because over here we are applying the mechanism on the basis of the date column. So your data should have the date parameters to implement incremental refresh. What are the steps that we need to follow for implementing incremental refresh? We have to follow the first step as defining the filter parameters, using the parameters as a filter, defining the incremental policy, and publish the changes to the Power BI service. Now let me take you through each of the steps and show you how it works. So let's get back to the example where I can show you the incremental refresh that I have implemented on a data set. Now, what you can see over here, I have used the Superstore data and I have built a dashboard. Now, this particular data I have taken from a SQL server. If I go to transform data and if I click on advanced editor, this particular has been taken from a SQL database. Now, what I have done, after I connected this particular data, using this manage parameter option, I have created two parameters. Now, if I click on this parameter, the range, start range, and the date, the end range. There are two parameters. Now, if I click on this particular manage parameter, you can see I've defined two parameters over here. The start range, I've defined the type as date and time, and I have kept the suggested value as any value and the current value I have taken, which is, so my data consists the data from 2016 to 2021. And I have defined the end range as a current value of my system, where you can see that I have defined the type as date and time and the suggested value as query. Now, why I have kept the suggested value as query, whereas I have kept the suggested value as any value in the start range. But in the end range, you can see I've kept it as query, because if the data is updated every day, this query suggested value will take the latest data from the dataset as per the current values and will add to the existing data when we publish this particular report to the Power BI service. So once we define this parameter with the help of this manage parameter option, and if I publish this particular report, now you know how to publish this report, right? With the help of this publish option, this report will get published to the Power BI service. So once we publish this report to the Power BI service, you know how to publish a report in Power BI service, right? Here is the report. Now, before we publish this report to the Power BI service, one important step that we need to do is we have to define the incremental refresh policy. And how we can do that? You have to right click on the dataset that you're using and you have to click on incremental refresh. And you can see the name of the database over here, right? You have to define the policy over here on the order date. Remember, I told you you need to have a order date column. You need to have a date column in your data set. So this particular data is storing the data for last 5 years, but when the data will refresh, it will only refresh 10 columns per day. So last 10 days of data, it will refresh every time the refresh option begins with the help of the gateway. So this is the incremental refresh policy that we have defined over here. And once the policies are defined, we publish this particular report, and then we'll go and we'll configure the SQL data. So this particular data set is taken from a SQL database. You know how to connect to a SQL database, right? So what we can do, we'll configure the gateway. We'll click over here, go to settings, and we'll click on manage gateway. And in manage gateway, we'll create a cluster under which we will configure the SQL Server incremental service. So over here, what I have done, I've created a data source, a cluster within the gateway clusters. I have named that particular cluster as SQL Server Incremental, and I've given the credentials of my server over here. Now that I've configured this particular database SQL Server under this particular cluster of gateway, I'll go to my SQL Server report, this report which I have just published. So I'll go to this particular report under my workspace and I click on this particular, I click on this dataset option, our schedule refresh option over here. I click on it and you can see under the gateway connection, I have configured this SQL Server. I mapped this SQL Server, the SQL Server incremental cluster that I have created under this gateway. So you know how to install a gateway. I have already discussed that in the session. So you can see the server name, the server details, and the data set that is coming from the server. And I have mapped it over here. And now that we have configured this particular SQL server with this gateway, every time when this particular gateway will refresh this data, only large last 10 days of data will be added to the existing data sets or the report. Now, if I come to this particular report over here under my workspace, and if I click on this particular report, and if I go to the refresh, what you can say, the refresh history basically, then we can easily check that how this particular refresh is taking place. Let me check this once. So we can check the report history, the refresh history. We can just click on it and you can go to settings, or else we can just click on it and go to, for example, uh, let me go to settings over here. And if I go to the refresh history, you can see that this particular report has been refreshed as per the schedule that has been configured in the gateway. And you can see that for each of the date when the schedule is completed, only last 10 days of data has been added for under each refresh. So on 18th, the refresh has been done. On 19th, it has been scheduled, it has completed. On 20th, it failed because the gateway was offline. So the SQL server in my system was not initialized. That's why this refresh failed. But again, on 21st, you can see this refresh has taken place on the scheduled time. And what will happen every time this refresh takes place? Only last 10 days of data will be extracted from the source by this gateway. And this is how the incremental refresh works. But to avail this service of incremental refresh, you have to always go for a pro and a premium license. You cannot perform an incremental refresh and the basic level of, or the basic version of Power BI. So this was all about the incremental refresh that I wanted to explain with you. We, the things that you need to keep in mind while doing incremental refresh is you have to make sure that your data is connected to a SQL or a database where you are using an import connection first. Second, you have to use parameters. Third, you need to have a pro or a premium license. Fifth, you have to define the incremental policy properly. And the fifth, and the next, the very important point is that you need to have a date parameter in your dataset. So this was all about for incremental refresh. Thank you for watching this video.